I've been playing a good bit of Wild Frost lately, and then my best friend recommended me this cute little roguelike shooty game, Tiny Rogues. And playing both in close proximity got me thinking about upgrades, specifically upgrade synergies. You know how there are those synergies that are pretty clear-cut, like when you have a shield-generating character who buffs another character whose damage scales with shields? Those are, pretty easy to understand. But then there are those synergies that are a little bit more hidden, a little bit more implied, like pairing a tank with a DPS or getting more attack speed when you have on-hit effects, for example. Now, those are also not difficult to understand if you've played like 5 games or more, but they are not explicitly stated on the unit or card or upgrade that we are discussing. And these two feel categorically different to me. And after a journey of discovery, I discovered why. Interestingly, I also discovered that the important part of that last sentence was feel rather than categorically different. I'm Simon from Games Deconstructed, and this is the Synergy video. Disclaimer, I will be using the words upgrade, card and mechanics somewhat interchangeably depending on what game I'm talking about. I hope it will be clear from the context which I mean, but bear that in mind please. Thank you. So, on one hand, we have mechanics that I think have pretty clear use cases. In presenting how they work, in the card description, the upgrade description, they also provide information on how they should be used. And this includes mechanics like builders and finishers, for example, where one part of the equation has an effect that increases the effectiveness of another, provided that the another is played after the first. Or maybe resource mechanics, where one card simply cannot be used without a resource that is generated by using another card. On top of that, of course, you have archetypes. Archetypes are categories of skills, upgrades or mechanics that share a common theme, like say frost magic or another elemental type, or they may share a mechanic, like graveyard interaction or movement speed. Archetypes often incentivize one into going deeper into them. They get stronger as you increase the number of pieces that belong to the archetype in your build. That sort of design paradigm is popular, but it is by far not the only option. You can also have the inverse, where a card loses power for each card it shares a keyword with, for example. Or you can have a beta inversion, I suppose, where cards from an archetype fit such a similar role that you don't really need that many cards that do the same thing. They sort of end up stepping on each other's toes. Let's say all wind abilities in your game give you movement speed, but to dodge enemy attacks and sort of outrun your enemies, you only need a finite amount of movement speed, and the returns start to sharply diminish after that level of movement speed. So the effects in that archetype would incentivize you to go further into the archetype up to a limit, and then you would be disincentivized from taking further abilities in that archetype. Or you could just have archetypes where the connection is just thematic or through sharing a keyword, but there is no explicit incentivization or disincentivizing, I guess, of acquiring more pieces in that archetype. But I think that's the most boring type of archetype. I think there should be either a positive or a negative feedback loop between archetype members, just design-wise. Now, it might seem like I took a lot of words to say nothing. That archetypes may incentivize a behavior, they may disincentivize that same behavior, that they may incentivize that behavior but only to a point, or that they might just thematically or mechanically connect but be neutral in terms of you wanting to pick up more of them. And yep, those are the possibilities, but let's keep in mind that they are not equally likely. Archetype existence and presentation, and I think it's the same thing for synergies in general. They play heavily on player expectation, both in the context of a single game and in the context of a player's understanding of the wider genre that single game exists in. So, if I see that there is a fire magic skill tree in a game that I've never touched before, I will probably not think, it is equally likely that I should, shouldn't, or can but don't have to pick up multiple of these skills. I will probably think that picking up more of them is going to make my existing ones better. Unless I spot it as one of the few exceptions where it works the other way, where I just want one. Or unless I judge the skill tree elements as providing benefits similar enough that they start to overlap in terms of their use cases. So, unless it's Y or Z, it's going to be X. And X in this case is going to be more archetype equals better. So based on my understanding of game design trends as a player, I will consider these scenarios in a descending order of likelihood. And that's where we come up to our first big point, that discussions of synergies will always be discussions of player perception and player knowledge. We simply can't escape that. Whether we try to categorize synergies into obvious and implied, as I am in this video, or whether we try to apply value judgments to particular synergistic mechanics, like, say, skill tree bad, I don't believe we can do so without viewing these design decisions as following, subverting, or zigzagging player expectations. If you were inclined to help me segue into my next point, you might ask, Simon, between builder, spender, resource mechanics, and archetypal synergies, do we not have enough mechanics to base a fun game on? And my answer is perhaps yes, but consider this. You might engage players more if you don't just design upgrades that get increasing bonuses the more of them you gather. Sets of armor in RPGs are an example, and they are cool. I'm playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey right now, so I can vouch for that firsthand. It feels good to have a complete set of 5 out of 5. But it's not a mechanic that's going to be the core of a gameplay loop unless there's a very weird indie game that I'm not aware of. Those sort of collectathon synergies are compelling as a topping, but they are rarely going to be the full scoop of ice cream, with the full scoop of ice cream in this metaphor being a compelling gameplay loop. And if you need further proof that our life ought to get a bit more complicated synergy-wise, let's see what the devs of Slay the Spire, which is a marvel of game design, have to say. Building synergies isn't just about getting a bonus for having both. At least one half of a synergy pair needs to work fine on its own. The other half has to, as part of its own existence, shift the puzzle itself. I.e., it can't just be stronger, it has to offer something like long-term strength at the cost of energy or card draw this turn. Game design tips from Slay the Spire by Cloudfall Studios. So these get as many as you can, and all of them will get better synergies for whom I really need to figure out a snappier name, maybe catch-em-all synergies, collectathon synergies. These synergies can also be a miss in terms of player enjoyment for other reasons. Good combos that don't belong to a single archetype or don't share a builder-spender mechanic or any of these techniques of direct synergy indication by the developer, those hidden, implied, indirect synergies offer a sense of discovery if the player happens upon them by trial and error. And that's a different type of satisfaction than the game may otherwise offer. Let's say the game I'm playing right now is satisfying because it keeps me in a flow state. It requires complete focus from me in order to complete feats of superhuman dexterity. But if I figure out a good build, that's a different kind of satisfaction, a more cerebral one, and having multiple types of satisfying content in your game, or like satisfying mechanic combos, is always going to be a good thing. Or if a player figures a combo out because they saw something similar in another game, that offers a sense of reward for player meta-knowledge for knowing the genre. If I have the foresight to put the tank in front of the damage dealer because I played WoW 10 years ago, that's a positive feeling of being rewarded for my meta-knowledge. I often talk about mechanics making a player feel smart or skillful, and I think rewarding genre savviness in this way plays very well into this. So this is the second category of synergies, the indirect, hidden ones, that rely on inductive reasoning, being able to intuit the combined effect of two disparate upgrades or mechanics, and judge the effectiveness of that intuited effect. Examples of this are the Holy Trinity, tank healer DPS, combining attack speed upgrades with on-hit effects or effects that give a positive payoff to a generally negative thing, like an effect that activates whenever you lose health on your turn. Losing health on your turn, generally negative, but the effect might make up for it. I mentioned before that we wouldn't be able to escape a discussion of player knowledge and player expectation, and that dastardly duo is catching up to us quick. Mark Rosewater of Magic the Gathering fame has an excellent article on a phenomenon that's at play here. My only gripe with that article is that it uses an obscenely pretentious SAT word for it: lenticularity. And after a bit of googling, I feel that what Mark writes about, and I intend to talk about now, is that essentially an effect may appear less complex to new players and more complex to experts, even though it's objectively the same set of words on a card. Mark uses this term to make a point about different types of complexity on Magic the Gathering cards, while I intend to talk about how it makes fuzzy that neat two-pronged categorization of synergies that I mentioned before. Because, as Rosewater wittily mentions, it all depends on how you look at it. So let's talk about how your perception of a synergy may depend on various contextual factors. So let's get the big one out of the way first. Every effect that doesn't exist in a vacuum has some unspoken implications. The effects in the first category of obvious implied synergies have clearer implications generally, or they have implications that are based on information that is easier to gather from playing the game or recall from your genre knowledge. We would consider that less lenticular. It's easier to tell what the effects in the first category will do, whether they will be any good, in what situations they'll be good, etc. This is not direct developer decision, in my opinion, or direct designer decision, I guess. It's parallel to the designer intention. It's hard to create an effect with explicitly clear consequences to the player without the developer being aware of these consequences. That would require the developer to have far less game knowledge than the target audience, which, despite what I've read on the Diablo 4 subreddit, I assume is rare. But it's entirely possible to create an effect that doesn't have clear use cases intentionally, to hide from the player what they should expect from a synergy or an upgrade or a combination of upgrades. Finding out what the developer intended may require gathering more game knowledge. Say, if you gain one resource but it is not yet explained what the resource will do, you'll only know if it's good or not after you find the spender, after you find what you can spend it on. It may also require more player focus, for example, calculating optimal combos, crunching the numbers, etc. It's possible for the developer to take actions that will obfuscate the effects of picking up a particular sequence of upgrades from the player. So the developers have the possibility of deciding some of that lenticularity, but players may of course perceive it vastly differently. Let's say a dev decided that discarding cards in a Warlock deck in a particular Hearthstone set is going to be a net positive mechanic. There are going to be payoffs for it, and I, as a player who played Hearthstone, am aware that I should be looking for positive effects, payoffs for discarding cards, some effect that scales with the number of cards discarded, etc. However, discarding cards is a negative effect in a vacuum. You prefer to have more cards. Cards are advantage, hence the term card advantage. So a different player that is not aware of there being payoffs for a negative effect, and that being a Warlock mechanic in that set, may view it differently. They may consider cards with discard effects bad, or they may see that discard as an additional cost instead of as a benefit, as a balancing factor perhaps on an otherwise decent card. And this is exactly why all the MTG player rates Hearthstone cards videos are so engaging, because they allow you to see how much of a difference general player knowledge has on judging the text on a card. Because, come on, it should be obvious from the text if the card is good or not. What do you mean contextual factors? What contextual factors? So a player may not realize what the developer is trying to say, even though the developer doesn't try to conceal it. And this is not due to a developer's decision to hide a combo or to allow the player to figure it out on their own. This is just a difference in communication styles and a difference in understanding of the genre perhaps, or the game in particular. This is not a good thing or a bad thing on its own, and it may be used by developers to present synergies that are somewhere in the middle of the obvious implied spectrum. By the way, it's a spectrum now, because this idea also turns out my neat two-category split into a bit of a simplistic model. So it's a spectrum now. All these mechanics that I categorized into one of the two categories exist somewhere on that spectrum. And sure, we can place a line on it to divide them into two categories, but that's going to depend on who's placing the line. I, as a player that mostly plays card games, may not be as knowledgeable on the genre conventions of, say, top-down roguelikes, so I might place it in a different place than you would. So depending on the game under discussion, where I place that line, where the developer intends for that line to be placed, and where you, another player with different genre knowledge, places the line, may differ starkly. Let's consider 20 minutes till dawn's combo of Abby plus Badgun. Abby has a skill that allows you to unload the entirety of your magazine very quickly, but in random directions, so it has a strength and limitation. The Badgun has low damage generally, but homing projectiles. The Badgun's homing projectiles alleviate the problem with shooting in random directions that shooting in random directions would normally cause you. And that's definitely an intentional synergy on the developer's part, but it is a lenticular one nonetheless. You have to have played the game, or similar games at least, enough to realize the limitations of Abby's ability and the benefits of the Badgun and the combined effect of the two being larger than the sum of its parts. If you know this style of game well, you'll figure it out pretty quickly, at least to the point of trying it out and deciding that yup, this works. So you'll give the combo a try, its effectiveness will probably be somewhere within the boundaries of your expectations. In terms of it existing on the hidden obvious scale, if you're well experienced in the genre, you'll probably place it somewhere over here. It's not explicitly stated in the description of Abby or the Badgun that you should pick it up, but it's probably not absolutely arcane. But it still may bear a sense of discovery for players newer to the game, such as myself, who would put it somewhere over here. And now I can only guess that the developer intended for it to be somewhere between these 2 points. They didn't want it to be explicitly obvious. If they did, they could have put something in the description of either of the elements, and I don't think they intended for it to be absolutely hidden, like the last thing that you figure out in the game. It's good to have a mix of both ends of the spectrum, because the obvious ones allow the player to get their bearings, establish a reasonably effective strategy straight out of the gate, etc. If I'm trying out a game that I know very little about, I'm probably going to gravitate towards the more obvious synergies initially, and that's not a bad thing, because it's more likely that I'm identifying those synergies right, and I expect to be rewarded with a reasonably effective build, though maybe not as effective as if I were to find something through trial and error. And it's generally good to allow the player an easy path in their first playthrough, just to not allow them to make all the mistakes immediately, because that's bad for player enjoyment. The other ones, the implied synergies, however, present an element of discovery, of exploratory play, and that gives the game more longevity, because not all of your combos are going to be figured out straight out the gate, and they generally make the game more interesting for players who are exploration focused. It also gives a different form of player satisfaction by rewarding out-of-game meta-knowledge, trial and error, etc. And it's good to have multiple sources of satisfaction in a game. What I find extremely interesting, though, is that you can't just decide when designing a game that yes, you'd like your players to be surprised by this combo and find the other one obvious, because that depends on player perception. The decisions you make about presenting your synergies, if you want to indicate which upgrades work together outright or are implied slyly, and your decisions to group them into archetypes, color them with thematic similarities like elemental types or dividing them into skill trees, these all present a sort of feedback loop. in that they take existing player knowledge and distill that into a judgment. These upgrades are going to work well together, or these upgrades are going to clash, or these upgrades are going to overlap. And making that judgment in turn helps players make further judgments, because as that judgment is verified, yes, I was right, those two do overlap, I am going to make further judgments with that knowledge about the next upgrades, next mechanics, next combinations that I come upon. And this presents a fascinating design puzzle, as you're attempting to communicate something to a player using subtle, indirect cues in most cases. And you're not 100% sure, ever, on how adept the player is at reading these cues. So it's kind of like playing bridge with someone you've just met. You are communicating riddles and you don't know how many of them are landing. In closing, let us consider this. In an ideal state, the interplay between mechanics in a game should have a good mix of both obvious and hidden synergies. These should be crafted by a developer that's mindful of how these synergies interact with existing player knowledge, but also how they shape that knowledge going forward. I would like to rephrase once again that when talking about upgrades and synergies, we cannot escape discussions of player perception and player knowledge. Thanks a lot for watching. This video was a blast to make, and I hope you had at least as much fun watching it as I had making it. There are multiple other game design videos in the same vein on my channel, and you should probably see one recommended on your screen right now. But before you go, maybe to watch the next one, hopefully, I would be very grateful if you subscribe to the channel, click the like button, or maybe left a nice comment. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.